In March 2020, India came to a grinding halt. And while we were coming to terms with our new reality, India's invisible workforce that quietly drives the economy was facing a crisis. The cab driver, the newspaper guy, the house help, the factory worker. Millions of migrant workers, the people who not just build our homes but our entire lives, left without work, cash and food. More so, left without the dignity of anyone knowing where they were and how they were, till they started walking. The visuals left us asking, why didn't we know better? We should have. But the truth is, even today, we know little about migration within our own borders. In a country where close to 30% people migrate, shifting villages, cities and states to earn a living, not having an understanding of who goes where, when and why impedes our ability to plan for the welfare of around 400 million migrant Indians. Omidyar Network India presents the Indian Express Thinc, Decoding India's Internal Migration, a series of solution-oriented conversations with thought leaders to discuss key issues that enable us to know better and plan better, and most importantly, help us improve the economic and social conditions of our migrant workforce, the workforce that keeps us going.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Indian Express Group, a very warm welcome to the Indian Express Think series on migration, presented by Omidyar Network India. IE Think is a thought-provoking forum that brings together thought leaders, policymakers, and corporate leaders to encourage a substantive exchange of ideas and to get the best minds to give it direction and solutions. Previously, the migration series has focused on the need for research and tracking of migration data, on the responsibility of the governments in both the home and the destination states of the migrants, on the health crises that affect them, and on how to mainstream their concerns, as well as what policy can do to create livelihoods. Today, we shift the focus to what can be done to improve housing for migrants. And for this session, we'll host a special keynote address and an insightful panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming our guest today, our keynote speaker, Iqbal Singh Chahal, Commissioner, Brihan Mumbai Municipal Corporation. Our panelists for the discussion, Amita Bhide, Professor, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Gautam Bhan, Associated Dean, Indian Institute for Human Settlements, Shayana Bhattacharya, Senior Social Protection Economist, World Bank, Manikandan KP, Institution Builder, Indian Housing Federation. The session will be moderated by Udit Mishra, Deputy Associate Editor, The Indian Express. I request the audience to remain connected throughout the session on social media as well. You can use the hashtag migration in India. Before we proceed, we have a short video clip on India's migration from Omidyar Network India. Let's have a look at that. Thank you. I will now request Udit to please take over.
Thanks a lot, Pooja. Hello and welcome to the 6th edition of IE Think Migration webinar series. As many of you would know who've watched us in the past, we've been picking each and every episode looking at one specific aspect of internal migration in India. It's a topic which rarely gets the kind of attention it deserves. And our focus has been that, we bring to light the various complexities so that people can understand and find some either government policy solutions or solutions from the corporate sector. In this edition, we'll look at housing. As many of you might know, last time we discussed livelihood opportunities and what can policy do to improve that. And livelihood opportunities was something that was massively hit by the COVID pandemic. And but today we are looking at housing, the lack of adequate housing for migrant workers. Now there is a larger issue about housing in India, that there's not adequate housing in India, especially in urban areas. But we want to focus again on the migrant workers. And I'm reminded of what Prime Minister Modi had said when he was announcing the initial nationwide lockdowns, when he said Corona means koi ghar se na nikle. That was the idea. Please do not step out of your home. And the immediate concern in the minds of many of us was, what happens to those who do not have a home? What do they not step out of? There are millions of migrant workers who really do not have any settled place which they call home. In fact, in the episodes we've done in the past, we've underscored this point that actually the lack of a settled notion of migration is what is the most troubling part about India's internal migration. It's what makes India's migrant workers most vulnerable, because their migration is not of the sort where they go from one city to another and then settle down there. It's a circular migration. They go and they come back, and they are sort of, it's really distress that is driving them from one place to the other. So the idea to look at housing is not just driven by concern out of COVID. Obviously, COVID would not have helped the troubles on housing. But the housing inadequacy is something that is more long-term, more long-standing, and actually the solutions cannot be found by giving, say, subsidized grains, or in a jiffy you cannot find the solutions. So, recognizing the nature of this problem, we wanted to focus one full episode on this, and we have today a panel and a keynote speaker who can give us a good understanding. I will come to the panelists next, but let me first introduce Mr. Chahal and invite him for the keynote address. Mr. Chahal is the Commissioner of BMC, and many of you know that migrants typically stay in slums or slum-like conditions. And in Mumbai, Dharavi is this iconic place now, which was seen as everything that was wrong with our urban policy. But BMC has done some exceptional work there, and last year's control of COVID was a remarkable experience. And let me first invite Mr. Chahal to share his experience of what was it to deal with this situation firsthand. And it will give us a good understanding of what it is in real life to deal with these problems. And then we'll go to a more detailed discussion with the panelists. Very grateful to Mr. Chahal for sparing the time. Please address us, sir.
Good evening, all respected audience. At the outset, I am grateful to the Indian Express for giving this opportunity today. This very great chance to share my views on this very extremely important issue of migration. Under Article 19 of the Constitution, every citizen of this country has a right to migrate and settle anywhere or move from one place to another place. It's his right. And if you see, this is a very, very, I would say, critical issue, which has been dominating our country for years together, whether it is migration happening in agriculture sector from, say, UP and Bihar into Punjab, or whether it is migration into industrial hubs of Maharashtra and Gujarat, or whether recently now you've seen some issues of people migrating to J&K being adversely hit the last couple of days. So, but I have a clear idea that, or clear conviction that it is the migrating people who are who have acted as a engine of growth of economy in the country. Whether you see big revolutions, green revolutions in Punjab or industrial revolutions in Maharashtra, Gujarat, and these states, but not for migratory population, things would not have been that successful. So literally, I would salute our people, workers who migrate and actually contribute to the national economy in a very big way. But at the same time, it is very sad that over the last many years, decades, things are not met at the desired level. Now, when COVID struck in March 2020 in India, and I remember that on the 24th of March 2020, when a 3-week initial lockdown was announced, which was extended to another 3 weeks, and the lockdown came into effect from 24th midnight, which is 25th morning. Since then, we saw how things unfolded, and although COVID was a very big challenge for all of us, but it became equally a big challenge to handle the migrant labor. And I'll just share some very hard statistics with you that how enormous or large this issue was. As the lockdown unfolded from 25th March, suddenly we found that there were lakhs of people in Mumbai who had nothing to eat. I'll come to the housing later on. And because all kitchens, restaurants, small eating places, they were all shut down in such a massive lockdown. And it was difficult for somebody even to eat out. And you must be all be well aware that a lot of this migrant labor, they don't have their own kitchens. They just go to some corner dhaba or area and have their food requirements met. So when we realized this, between 30th of March 2020 and July 2020, almost the 3 months, April, May, June, you'll be surprised that when we started community kitchens, because there was no other option left, otherwise people would have died of hunger. So starting on 31st March, we had 46 kitchens running in various parts of Mumbai. And at a peak time, on a particular day, which was 14th of May, we had 7,24,000 food packets distributed in a single day. And this figure of 7,24,000 packets, and we were giving 2 packets morning and evening to every needy person, which means almost 3.6 lakh people were being provided food in this initiative. And this figure of 7.24 lakh, which peaked on 14th of May, but throughout May, June, these 2 months, even April also, it was never less than 6 lakhs distribution of per day. And then another indication of the number of people who were getting affected, that when the train started, were announced that they could go back to their homes from Mumbai, the total number of food packets which were given by MCGM to migrant labor who were going in trains back home, this exact number this number works out to a huge one. And as many as 6.6 lakh food packets were given to people leaving Mumbai, which means 6.6 lakh people actually left in trains. And in this figure, I don't have a figure of people who have gone by buses, like people like Sonu Sood, who had arranged buses for them. So if you add all this, the figure could be much higher. And ultimately, if you see in these 3 months, the total number of food packets which were distributed was whopping 45 million, to be precise, 4.54 crores. 45.4 million food packets were distributed. And besides expenditure of 127 crore by MCGM just for this food packets, Mumbai has a tradition where corporates always come in a big way to help the institutions like MCGM. And we had whole lot of corporates like the Tata Group, the Wadia Group, the Reliance, and so many others who were contributing to this voluntary effort. But this clearly shows that almost near to 1 million people were affected who needed to be helped for food. And I'm sure this entire category were short of housing also. They must be living in a makeshift places, some institute, construction labor camps, or in slums. And now, if I spend a minute or 2 minutes on the situation in Maharashtra, because we were monitoring that also. Maharashtra, when this lockdown was set on 25th March onwards, within a week's time, we had 4,630 migrant camps. There are huge camps which were set up in rural areas, semi-rural areas, talukas, by the district collectors. And this 4,630 labor camps which were established, it was housing 4.54 lakh people. And these are people who started moving, but they were told to come to a particular place where they'll be looked after, they'll be given free food, they'll be given, doctors would be there. We had arranged facilities for their other stuff like drinking water. Then we started TV, yoga sessions there. Then we had a medical team posted there. So then they would get cooked meals there with the NGO effort and the effort of local collectors. And besides that, for like distribution of sanitary napkins, available doctors, all this this was done for this 4.54 lakh people who actually stayed for a couple of weeks continuously in these camps which were organized. And if you put all these figures, definitely the number of migrant labor which moved out of Maharashtra was 1 million plus. And this COVID suddenly highlighted this issue, and people started walking on the roads. There were queues on the stations and bus stops, and some even unfortunate incidents happened when these people were moving. So this actually, I would say that migrant labor issue, it exists today also. It existed from decades, but this COVID further highlighted the issues of migrant labor. Now, when we say that migrant labor is the backbone of economy, they have a major role in developing the country. So I think it is our duty also. We are not doing any favor to them. It is our duty that we must take care of their needs, and they do take care of their own need of food because they earn a livelihood. But where the corporates, the governments, the bodies like MCGM have to chip in, that is their housing need. And that is why I say today's theme is very well selected, that what can be done to improve the housing of the migrants. Now, as far as MCGM is concerned, we have been struggling with this issue, and the government of Maharashtra is equally concerned about this, because Maharashtra is a major beneficiary of a large number of migrant labor which comes from various states of India, and they have contributed to the GDP of the state, which is one of the highest in the country, and this is what has made Maharashtra one of the most industrialized states in the country. And considering this, the government of Maharashtra had passed a very ambitious new housing policy way back in 2008. Now in 2000, in the housing policy, this was for the MMR region because large number of labor is in MMR region. Like I said, the 1 million movement was virtually from MMR, Mumbai and places around, like with Thane, Navi Mumbai, Bhiwandi, Ulhasnagar, Kalyan, Dombivli, Vasai Virar, Mira Bhayandar, Panvel. This is a great hub of where a lot of migrant labor are working, and plus the real estate sector of Mumbai. I can tell you that Mumbai's real estate sector cannot survive without migrant labor. In fact, when some restrictions were mellowed down or slowed down, some of the migrant labor was brought by air flights by the local real estate developers. You must have read in the newspapers that some of the big real estate developers, they brought the labor back by offering them flight tickets and flying them back to Mumbai. This shows that how important this component is for their overall scheme of things. So Maharashtra government had announced housing policy where the concept of rental housing was launched for the first time. And MMRDA, the Mumbai Metropolitan Regional Development Authority, that was made a nodal agency for the entire MMR, this 9 municipal corporations in Mumbai, around Mumbai and including MCGM, which nearly houses almost 2.5 crore population. And I would say more than a million, maybe much more than that, migrant population. So this, the rental housing policy envisaged that unlike the existing FSI of 0.1, which was available in MMR outside this municipal limits, like if you go in the villages around Bhiwandi or the villages around Ambarnath Kalyan or smaller places like Panvel, outskirts, there the normal available FSI is 0.1, and MMR stretches right from Vasai Virar up to Raigad district, and this side up to Khopoli and up to Igatpuri. So it was decided that any private landowner who would come forward and would be interested in building rental housing, he'll be given FSI of 4.0, which is almost 40 times of what he ordinarily gets. And in FSI of 4.0, he was supposed to construct 25% of the buildable for rental housing and hand over it free of cost to MMRDA. And this rental housing would be provided to migrant labor by charging some nominal monthly rent. And I'm happy to say that many developers came forward. Like Tata has built a huge complex near Kalyan, which is known as Amantra. So right now, the figures which I have with me, 42,000 tenements are under construction, which can house almost more than a lakh of people. And out of those 42,000 tenements which have been sanctioned, it includes the major real estate players in Mumbai like Tata, then Dosti Group, then Symphony, then Adiraj. And out of this 42,000, 8,000 are already constructed and handed over to MMRDA. And remaining are under construction. So I'm sure that maybe in another 1 or 2 years' time, this 42,000 pool will be available, which can be made, which is actually meant for migrant labor. Anybody coming to Mumbai, rather than going into slum and staying unauthorisedly there, he can be given this rented accommodation until the time he develops and he gets to some proper place. Besides this, we in MCGM, we have started 2 other schemes where such transit accommodation or rental accommodation can come up. One is that when we got this new development control of Mumbai published with effective from October 2018, DCPR 2034, there we said that those in the special development zones, SDZs, which are predominantly private ownership, if anybody in Mumbai would like to, right now, special development zones, hardly any construction is allowed. except part of little bit of industrial. But we said that if you would like to come forward, if you have more than 2 hectares of a unit of land available with you, more than 2 hectares, 30% of the land, if you construct this rental housing, we would allow you the construction in this special development zones. Now, second is, now this particular thing is very debatable because special development zones and no development zones are predominantly kept as green lungs of the city. And presently we have something called EP, the extra portion of the development plan, which when the development plan is prepared, the extra portion EP is prepared for those plots where different opinions are there, and they're submitted to the urban development department. Government takes a call on that, whether to clear that EP or not. So it is still getting debated that whether we should touch these so-called special development zone, which are de facto, I would say, no development zones. Should we allow construction in those plots or not? And although we say that like Mumbai has almost 4,000 acres of no development zones where we strongly feel that nothing should come. Whereas in special development zone, like for example, our NESCO, the exhibition center, for example, which is housing the world's largest COVID center now, the NESCO COVID center, this is a special development zone. Now in the special development zone, the exhibition center is already functioning as industrial activity. Also, this particular NESCO, this is roughly 232,000 square meters of land, which is almost, it is like, I would say, almost 60-70 acres of land. So in such places, if part of the land, they come forward for rental housing, we can give them enhanced FSI, otherwise present FSI is very meager there. So this is one idea we have floated to address this issue of migrant labor and providing them rental accommodation. Then we came up with this very ambitious policy of accommodation reservation. Now, you know, see, all over the country, if you take any small municipality or local body or municipal corporation, anywhere in the country, when we prepare a development plan, so we simply on the paper, we make reservations for schools, for hospitals, for affordable housing, for some some community centers, for some working women's hostel, for dormitories. But the kind of compensation which is paid to acquire these lands, to realize this reservation, supposing this somebody's private plot is now reserved for say a hospital. Now to build a hospital or build a school there, the MCGM, for example, must pay him compensation. And as per the latest land acquisition norms, we pay people twice the rate of ready reckoner in urban areas and 4 times the ready reckoner in rural areas. So it is a humongous amount of money which we have to pay to acquire these lands. For example, to build this Nagpur Mumbai prosperity corridor, Smriti Mahamarg, that 700 kilometer plus 8-lane cement concrete road, which is in the last final phases of getting completed now. You'll be surprised that in Thane district, we had to pay 18 crore rupees per acre. 18 crore rupees per hectare. Per hectare, 18 crore rupees was paid to acquire the land. Now, just imagine in small municipalities which are struggling to pay salary to their staff, or even a big municipal corporation like Mumbai, if we tend to acquire all these reservations, which are for many activities, it will cost us thousands of crores of rupees. And we will never be able to actually acquire them and realize the reservation, which is there for many activities like crematoriums or playgrounds or schools or hospitals or hostels or such other activities. So we decided to come with the very ambitious policy of accommodation reservation, which is quite unique to Mumbai. In fact, I was talking to my colleagues in northern India. I said, why don't you also adopt accommodation reservation in places like Haryana, Punjab, Delhi, this area? So in accommodation reservation, we say that if you have a plot which is in the green zone, or it is now meant for reservation, it is under some reservation, Now you cannot build this plot for a housing or for your activity because you get freeze till 2034. When somebody's plot is now reserved for, say, a public school where a municipality school has to come up. And now so that is a 5-acre plot. So we tell him that why don't you come under accommodation reservation? Because we don't have money to pay you upfront 5-acre cost of the land, which can be hundreds of crores. And we say that 30% of the land you keep, 70% of the land you give us free of cost. And we will give you full FSI on the 30% plot. Supposing FSI is 1. So a 1,000-meter plot can build 1,000 square meters. We say you take 300 meters and build 1,000 meters on your plot. So you are not at loss at all. You are realizing the full potential of your plot, even if by surrendering 70% to the BMC. So the 70% will come to us free of cost. 30% he retains, and we approve his building plan with full FSI potential as if he was developing his 1,000 square meter plot, for example. And he's not at loss at all. And we also get 70% of the plot where we can put our money and build the building for the school. So this is a very successful model which has happened to overcome this huge burden of land acquisition amounts. So this is one idea where now we are putting into practice to build affordable housing also. Because large number of plots in Mumbai in this DP plan are meant for affordable housing. And majority of them, almost all of them are in private ownership. And we have been telling people that please come forward in accommodation reservation, because otherwise you are not supposed to even touch that piece of plot is of no use to you. So under accommodation reservation also and the next 5 years we plan to build a sizable amount of rental housing which can help the migrant labor. And I'm sure this idea can be replicated in many bigger cities of India, where the local municipal authority doesn't shell out anything at all except the construction cost of that building, which has to be constructed. But in any construction, almost 70% of the cost in like a city like Mumbai goes on land. 30% goes even if you construct a 20-story building. So this 70% becomes free of cost to you under this accommodation reservation. So this is one idea where many bigger cities can also think of addressing the issue of migrant labor. And the next is that we have a lot of plots now we have reserved for dormitories also. So there also under accommodation reservation, we are trying to coerce and influence the private landowners that let us join hands and you come under accommodation reservation so that we can construct these activities. Now, besides this, the DCPR also provides for construction of transit accommodation, transit camps, and labor camps. For large layouts, people can build a good quality transit camp or a labor camp. And this is an activity which can be officially approved when we approve the building plans of that particular layout. So this is another idea where we should encourage large layouts. For example, if somebody is building a township on the outskirts of Mumbai or Delhi or say another big city, Ahmedabad or Surat or Indore or Bhopal, wherever it is. So in this large townships, which is maybe 50-acre, 100-acre layouts, we have a policy now that the developer can always apply for permanent accommodation there, which is not just like a very shabby kind of a construction, but it can be a permanent pool of accommodation where, because this township can go on for 15-20 years in phases. For example, if some big house is constructing a township, it can be phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and it takes maybe 20 years to develop a full township. So rather than putting them in shanties all the time, it is we have now approved policy in the DCR plan that you please come forward where you may have phase 2 or phase 3 or phase 4 of your project lined up of 10 years, you build a permanent accommodation there. And the labor may keep on changing, but they will get decent accommodation in this permanent kind of transit camp or labor camp or in situ, which is permissible. So these are the various ideas where I would say that to a certain extent this issue can be addressed. And but let me make it very clear that everybody has to join hands in this. It is very difficult for a government to one municipal authority to address this issue fully, unless all the corporates, the industrial houses, the real estate developers, I would say even the very important role can be played by media to create a public opinion and to create a public perception. Your role of the media is paramount. It is very, very important. And you are people who are opinion makers. And I'm sure a lot of people are not aware of these ideas. But if through the power of pen, this message is carried loud and clear, and it is this issue is addressed again and again, a lot of people will come forward who may not be aware that these things does exist, and it's a win-win situation for the stakeholders. For example, I say in accommodation reservation, it's a win-win for everybody. Otherwise, like what happens in smaller towns? Smaller towns, I'm talking about say Aurangabad or Nasik. I call them a smaller town when you compare with Mumbai. Somebody's piece of land is now got stuck up in the creation of a garden. So for the municipality, it's a very low priority to create a garden. And it's a huge land. It will be 10, 15 acres. Maybe for the next 10, 15 years, the municipality will never have the courage to pay him a huge amount of money to create a garden. And that poor fellow is also stuck up because he cannot do anything. So once he comes in accommodation reservation, he gets the full potential of his garden. And he gets the full authority to construct legally whatever he wants, as if there is no reservation there. So this is how it is win-win for both the parties. So I'm sure if every city in the country starts thinking on these lines, maybe in not immediately in the next 5 to 10 years from now, huge pool can be created, because except creating rental housing, there can't be many other solutions which may be readily available. Because supposing if somebody has migrated from a village to a city like say Aurangabad or Nasik or Pune or Nagpur or even Mumbai or Thane, I am sure he doesn't want to live in a slum. He doesn't have option. That's why he goes to live there. But if you create say a one-room accommodation with a shared toilet or independent toilet, and the rent is, say in a place like Bhiwandi is say 500 rupees for the room, and he is earning say 20,000 rupees a month, I am sure he'll be happy to pay 500 rupees for that one-room accommodation, because migrants they don't move with children and families. The children and families are left behind. So the majority of the migrant labor, they can be adjusted in such small accommodation, which can be 300 square feet, 250 square feet with one toilet, and normally heat somewhere out here and there. So this can largely address their housing needs. So these are some of the ideas which come to my mind, and I'm sure we can work on this. And I would be happy to address any questions. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chahal. That was a fantastic exposition of how the real life situation, how tough it is, the scale at which you mentioned 1 million migrants trying to move out, over 4,600 camps that you talked about, 6 lakh food packets. It just gives you a sense of the kind of distress that is there when things go wrong, but also tells us the scale at which this problem in any case exists. And some of the interesting things that you mentioned, because sitting at homes, we don't always realize what are the kind of innovative solutions there can be, like the talk about FSI being improved or used as a regulatory tool to solve some of these problems. For many of the viewers, FSI is floor space index. So how many floors you can make, and how can you use that same space. And you also mentioned about the accommodation reservation policy, again, a very innovative way to sort of figure out, can there be solutions within the same plot of land? So I'm very grateful for sharing these remarks. Let me just check whether we have any queries from the audience as of now. I don't think we have any query right now. But if any of the panelists, if they want to ask any question, they're most welcome from the panel.
This is Shayana.
Shayana.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be very brief.
Yeah.
This was actually it's fascinating to hear, Mr. Chahal. Thank you so much for those remarks.
Thank you.
I was actually curious, Mr. Chahal, the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, Mahua, has come out with this affordable rental housing program of its own, which operates at the national level. Of course, the implementation is in states. I was curious how that initiative interacts with what you were just describing right now about working with different partners to provide the supply of housing through rental housing. Is this a municipal-led independent initiative, or does that also link to the national program that is being envisaged? Thank you. That's my question.
Yeah, this is very independent because this policy was framed in 2008. I remember that time I was Vice President and Chief Executive Officer of MHADA, the Maharashtra Housing and Area Development Authority in Mumbai, and Mr. Swadhin Kshatriya, who later on became our Chief Secretary, and later on he was Municipal Commissioner of Mumbai also later on. He was a Housing Secretary that time. So we had jointly drafted that the new housing policy for the state of Maharashtra in 2007-8, which was announced in 2008. So in 2008 housing policy, this rental housing policy came, and in 2008, MMRD was made nodal authority for creation of a pool of 100,000 rental houses in Mumbai. And this Government of India thing has come later on, but I'm not very much aware of Government of India's policy, so I should not comment on that. But Government of India's one other policy which I'm aware of, that was the very ambitious program of Government of India to provide a house to every citizen. And under that, the government of Maharashtra has formed one Maharashtra Housing Corporation. It is different from Maharashtra Housing and Area Development Authority. It's known as Maharashtra Housing Corporation. It is like a sister concern of MHADA only. This was created when our former Chief Minister, Devendra Fadnavis sir, was CM of Maharashtra sometime in 2018-19. And under that policy, the mandate of the government is that we must give a house to every person who doesn't have a house in the state of Maharashtra. It's in a population of 12.5 crores. Whether it is 245 small municipalities or villages around. So in that policy, this policy is basically driven by Mahua. And in this policy, there is subsidy component which comes from Government of India. And partly the beneficiary has to shell in, which is very small amount, 10%. And in this Maharashtra Housing Corporation was made nodal authority. And if any person who owns land in, say, a small municipality or a village, he can sign an MOU with this housing corporation, and housing corporation assures that they will buy over or take over this housing created by him in his private land, and it can be allotted to people who need it. For example, if you have a small municipality like, say, Chalisgaon or say Nandurbar or Dhulia, and or say it is down in Pune or maybe Vajapur, Gangapur and Aurangabad. So supposing if somebody like me, I have say land there, for example, and I say I have 10 acres of land there on the outskirts of say Chalisgaon town. So there, and my reservation is agriculture. So I can't do anything in the agriculture piece of plot. So I will go to the Maharashtra Housing Corporation. They will give me permissions. I'll become a partner with the Maharashtra Housing Corporation, and we'll build housing there. And that housing, the bulk component of subsidy Government of India will put in there. and the beneficiaries will be selected simultaneously, who are homeless people around in that area, and they will be accommodated in this thing. And as a landowner, the landowner is given some incentive for the certain portion of the land. So that policy is in existence, because I was aware of that when I was working in government before becoming MCGM commissioner. So that is there, but this accommodation reservation is unique to Mumbai. It doesn't exist in, say, a place like Aurangabad or Nasik also. And this issue of rental housing, where we say that right now 42,000 tenements are in construction, 8,000 already built up. This process started way back in 2008.
Right. I think Professor Bide, you had a query or a comment?
Yeah. Thanks, Vidit, and thanks, Mr. Chahal, for a interesting talk. Really gives a lot of insights into the scale of challenges that Mumbai has had to face. So my question had to do with in your explanations and your ideas about what can be done about housing for migrants. You identified the availability of land as one of the central challenges. I would like you to very briefly outline whether, besides acquisition of land and making land available, what are the other policy changes that you foresee and challenges that you foresee in making this housing reach migrants?
You know, the other thing which I just mentioned, that let us not get into acquisition, let us not get into accommodation reservation. Like I just mentioned, that supposing Nasik, take a good example, Nasik is a good sized city, neither very big nor very small. So supposing we need to construct, say, 10,000 tenements immediately for migrant labor in Nasik. The local administration should announce to the landowners on the outskirts of the city, touching the peripheral limits of the city, that anybody owning land there, it's a no development zone, it's agriculture zone, nothing can be done there except agriculture. Although being in the close vicinity, it is as good as the land within the corporation. It may take you 10-15 years for the next development plan to be launched in some 2030 or 2040. Till that, you are stuck up. You can't develop your land's potential. So offer him some incentives. Don't acquire that land, or enter into a partnership with him. And in that partnership, let him allow to harness the commercial potential of that land, and let him share some proceeds with the local authority, which goes in form of rental housing. And this way, I would say that the local municipality may not spend anything at all. We can tell him only that you have to construct this small tenements for transit accommodation or rental accommodation. For example, if somebody has 1 acre of land, which is in the agriculture zone, touching the outskirts of any city of India, you say, okay, in 1 acre, if you are allowed 100 units of construction, as per the local FSI or FAR, whatever it's called in various parts of the country. So out of this 100 units, today you can't construct anything because you have 0 FAR available to you. So you construct, we'll give you 100 units of construction, 25 you construct with your own cost and give it to us free of cost. 75 you build of your own, whether you call it a bigger or luxury apartment or whatever it is, do whatever you want to do. And you sell in the open market, you recover your investment or cost, and you reap profits also. So I'm sure overnight, a lot of people will come forward for this idea. And this is very much doable, where the local authority doesn't even have to shell out a single rupee. So, and in this example of mine, every single municipality of the country can go for this idea without having any financial burden.
Right. Thanks a lot, Mr. Chahal. Very grateful for your time and your insights and giving us a sense of how big the problem is. And
thank you very much.
Yeah. Let's now move on to the panel. And I
may I take you leave because I have to go for another meeting.
Sure, sir. Sure.
So once again, thank you very much for providing this opportunity. I'm really grateful to the Indian Express. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's move to the panel, and let me just again welcome all the four panelists. We have some of the best voices on this issue. As anybody who knows on housing matters, Professor Amita Bhide requires no introduction. She is the foremost authority, and I remember when we started off the webinar series, the very first episode, I was approaching her at that time to have her in the panel. Unfortunately, at that time, she had some classes and the scheduling did not work out, but I'm very glad that she's here with us. We also have Gautam Bhan from Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and he's just, we were just joking that he's just been promoted to Associate Dean, and a lot of his friends are now calling him up saying, why didn't you announce it? How did they get to know from Indian Express? But well, we broke that story on the advertisement for this webinar. Gautam has a PhD in city and regional planning from UC Berkeley, and we really hope. I mean, from my interaction with a lot of people who were working with migrants in the last 1 year, I heard Gautam's name from a lot of them, and they've all wanted, you know, we should feature him in one of the panels, and housing is something that is his core area of interest. Let me also welcome Shayana Bhattacharya from the World Bank. She has just come out with a book, which is very topical, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, which is, you know, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh is right now has very different meanings. But her book is quite remarkable because it looks at the journey of Indian women and in the workplace and relates it with Shah Rukh Khan. So it's an interesting take. But Shayana is the lead on social safety nets in the World Bank, and that's why we wanted her here, because she has an understanding of how many other countries, because the World Bank network covers such a huge area, how have other countries sort of looked at housing problem for migrants? Not every country would have the kind of scale that we are talking about. But then there's China. So perhaps there are some examples there. And some equally disadvantaged countries in other ways. We were discussing perhaps Mexico that she can perhaps talk about. And then we have Mr. Manikandan KP from the Indian Housing Federation. What is quite remarkable is that the Indian Housing Federation sort of looks at low-cost solutions, housing solutions for people who are from the socially and economically weaker sections. And Mr. Manikandan has studied housing finance, and which is a very specific thing, very interesting to my mind, from the Wharton Real Estate Center in University of Pennsylvania. And I'd be very curious to understand that, you know, when we typically talk in market sense and we talk about private sector solutions, we always look at the ability for the consumer to pay. Here we have a consumer who's really poor, quite incapable of paying. We are, since last year now, happily providing free food to 800 million people. That's the second largest country on the planet. So that's the level of deprivation we are looking at. Migrants, whichever way we define them, would be something like 200 to 400 to 600 million. And even if we were to look at a very conservative estimate, we are looking at hundreds of million of migrants that we are talking about here. So it would be interesting to figure out how he looks at the whole gamut of issues and how does financing work. Now, I would like to start with Professor Bhide in terms of, again, just setting quickly the context for this discussion. Mr. Chahal talked about a lot of regulatory solutions, what we typically called, regulatory cholesterol, that, can you cut down some steps? Can you tweak, say, FSI and solve certain things? Think in terms of rentals and not ownership and whatever. And then policies like accommodation and reservation policies. Now, I'm sure there are far more complicated issues than just me mouthing this, but I wanted to come to you to set the context for our viewer of how big the problem is and why does it matter. I mean, obviously it's very natural for us to figure out that people who do not have a roof over their head will have all kinds of problems. If we don't have it for one night, we'll have all kinds of problems. But just set the context for us, why it matters, and especially for migrant workers.
So clearly, I think housing is a very, very critical benefit and a very critical, I would say, for the overall hazards that it poses, the decency of life, the dignity of life for a worker. I think the complexity of the issue that we have is that in the last several years, we have equated housing equivalent to permanent housing, ownership housing, housing located in one place. We have not talked about migration. We have not figured on the needs which come out of migration. And I think there is clearly a policy amnesia, I would say, when it comes to thinking about migrants at all. And therefore, our imaginations literally go wonky when it comes to thinking about housing for migrants. I'm quickly going to talk about, not in terms of numbers, but really that in my view, there are three kinds of migrants for whom the crisis is very, very critical. Okay. The one is large employers, but migrants who are seasonal. Possible to do housing, but at the same time, you need to think imaginatively. And where there are the employers and the establishments are very large, but they don't acknowledge that migrant population, which may be at the bottom ladder. The second is of a category of migrants where it is more difficult and more complicated to do housing because the difference between the employer and the laborer is very, very thin. And these are largely people in informal industries, and which is very, very substantive now in our cities. And the third category of migrant workers is what I would call as own account workers. And these own account workers where neither the employer is fixed, nor perhaps a place of work is fixed often, but they are here because of other social networks. And this is also a very complicated category to address. Okay. I think all our housing policies, if one is kind of taking a look, have not addressed the needs of any of these three groups that I'm discussing. Okay. In fact, they are so heavily influenced by domicile. Just to give one very, like taking a pot shot, but the very rental housing policy that Mr. Chahal was talking about, just imagine the fact that he gave figures about more than 6.5 lakh packets of food, 7.2 lakhs to be precise, 3.6 lakhs on a single time basis. The number of houses being envisaged all in the peripheries, 42,000. I'm quoting his numbers. I don't even want to contest them. And over from 2008 to we are now talking about 2021, 8,000 houses which are built. And if you look at the eligibility and what has been announced by the MMRDA a long time back, okay, is that they should have a domicile of 14 years. Now, having these kind of policies goes completely against the overall spirit of having to reach out to migrants. So I think housing migrants needs a very different approach. And firstly, a need assessment of who are you talking about? Where do they stay? Where do they work? What kind of housing needs do they have? And I think today, so it has to be a combination of multiple things. And our current housing policies are just not doing it. And as a result, it becomes not just equated to the issue of slums or informal settlements that we have, but within the informal settlements, the migrant workers get housed in some of the most indignified and worst conditions, even within settlements. They are also then equated with a lot of the homeless populations in the cities whose numbers are just increasing. So we really need to open up these categories and begin to think about who are we talking about, what kind of housing, where do they work, what are their precise housing needs. Do they want a permanent house located in the periphery of the city? Is that what is the aspiration of migrants? It may be after 14 years, but not now. What are the here and now housing solutions? I'll stop.
Right. Great. Some very valid points about the basic approach to how policy should be governed. Gautam, would you want to join in here? I mean, how you see the problem here?
No, I can't agree more with Amita. I think that's one of the ways to think a little bit about housing in general, rental housing in particular. If you just take on from what Amita said, if we ask before COVID, how did migrant workers find a place to live in the city despite the policy amnesia? Right? There are already housing practices that we have to build and learn upon. Because where migrant workers come to and where they find a house and the conditions in which they find a house is already giving you a set of possibilities, a set of practices. There are systems that exist in place, but those systems are deeply vulnerable and often very inadequate, like Amita is saying, but they are also viable. They're in the right location. They're near work. They fit kinship and social patterns. They often, and this is important to understand, both reinforce but also counter caste, religious, and gender markers of migration. Right? Migrants are not unmarked bodies that come only into housing markets marked by demand and supply. These are deeply identity-linked movements that are shaped in certain ways. So I think that I would say that the question why we keep missing this is we are not learning from migrants on how they have produced that housing and saying, what can we do to make this process easier, shorter, and better, right? Because migrants are telling you where viable rental housing locations are. You know, in real estate, in housing, we often talk about location, location, location. But location is more important for a migrant worker than it is for a real estate developer, even more. Migrants don't come to the city for housing. They come to the city for work. The proximity to work is what determines all their housing choices. So I think it's really important that we don't start seeing migrants as helpless, invisible, unseen. Migrant workers in India are not unseen. They are actually hyper visible and deliberately invisibilized. There's a big difference to those two contexts. So if we see them as agents that make rational housing choices under extreme conditions, the question I want to ask is, before we build this 42,000 houses, that is one, like Amita is saying, a fraction of the demand, before we also ask and say, the MMRDA target he mentioned for 100,000 houses, there is a reason why we have not built those 100,000 rental houses, right? So I think in many ways, I want to say, what's the existing market? Is it in slums, quote unquote? Is it in urban villages? Is it in complex industrial areas? Are there 9 security guards from Assam living together and now already in the first floor house in a back lane in different neighborhoods in all our cities? Let's understand these practices and say, what can we do with what exists? Because I think my general sense around our housing problems, we cannot build our way out of India's housing shortage. We will never, no matter how well-intentioned the government is, have the capacity to build at the scale we want. The largest stock of affordable housing in Indian cities has been built by people themselves, always in tension with law and planning. So the combination of building new, I think Mr. Chahal should do all the things that he is doing, right? And it should be one of the 10 things we are doing. That's what a complex problem demands. But the major work has to say, protect, regulate, recognize all the informal, inadequate rental housing that is all over our cities today. Begin to protect and improve that housing, right? Low-income rental housing in the private market, money will tell you, happens despite regulation. There is no enabling taxation. There are no enabling financial mechanisms, even for the formal market. But a majority of our rental housing is not in the formal market. FSI, land, accommodation reservation, this is the game of the formal housing market. It must be played, but we must not confuse it for the housing question in India, because those two are not put together. My last word before I stop will also be one plea. Mumbai is a very particular urban condition. And we cannot think about the migrant housing question in urban India from Mumbai. The FSI trading land developer gains we're talking about will not work in Maharashtrian urban conditions, let alone Mumbai. And I think it's very important that we don't try and only work through market mechanisms. I think this is really important. There are many markets, some with capital M's and developers, some with small M's and contractors. Take both seriously and we can begin going somewhere.
Thanks, Gautam. Shayana, you wanted to say something on that?
Thanks, Udit. I actually just wanted to echo a point Gautam made, and this is actually building off what other countries have done, and in fact, what successful examples in India seem to suggest, which is that, right now, and I think we can talk about this when I come to my comments later, the solution always seems to be a scheme, and it's the same housing scheme. And in fact, my question to Mr. Chahal was precisely this, that there's a state program, there's a national program, and they're obviously different, and the coordination is a different story altogether. You heard him say that these are distinct initiatives. And what has happened is, because you have this conception of the same standardized scheme, which has then been implemented across a continuum of locations, some places where there are actually viable private housing markets, informal, formal, different kinds of examples of social housing, and then other areas where perhaps there is, in some cases, need to build up. One of the key principles of the housing policy, and in fact, this is related to the broader social protection and safety net policy for migrants, especially for a dynamic and moving India, has to be decentralization. It has to allow and empower local governments, not just at the state. I would contend, particularly if you look at Mexican, Brazilian, even Chinese examples, the way a lot of these problems are addressed is not by having a one-size-fits-all one program. It in fact creates regulation which allows for a lot more dynamism at the local level. And so, Mr. Chahal, in the context of Bombay, can set up partnerships with different private sector entities. But perhaps in Delhi, where the regulatory environment and also the way land is used and owned looks very different, will have very different sets of experiences and examples and lessons, I think, as Amita ji and Gautam were saying. So one of the things I just wanted to echo, and I'll add later when we talk about just the broader global experience, is that decentralization and empowering local contextual solutions to not just, and this is a housing crisis which is linked to, by the way, transport, income security. They're all actually completely linked, and there are lots of numbers on that which I'll share as we discuss further. But I just wanted to echo the point that Gautam's making, that Bombay is particular, but in fact, if you look at India, different states, towns, cities, there's such a continuum, and we're yet to see that level of empowerment. We know what's happening with municipalities and municipal governance, and that has to be key moving forward, because other than that, you just have the same copy-paste scheme approach, which is just not working in terms of coverage. Let me stop there.
Thanks. I'll get back to you just in a moment on the lessons we can learn from some of the global examples, but I want to come to Mr. Manikandan about from a common man's perspective, it appears as if this lot of migrant workers who are typically working in informal occupations, or even if they're working for an organized company in the organized sector, their contracts themselves are informal. They're not sort of, very well contracted to work. The common man sitting in the drawing room thinks that the only solution to this is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana or a Mukhyamantri Awas Yojana or something of that nature. The only solution that exists is government uses tax money to make some houses. Now, you've actually consulted both at the central ministry and at the state level in Assam. And that's why I want to know, because can you put it all together for us, this difference between, say, Maharashtra being different from any other destination state, and then there are being basic differences between a central scheme and a state scheme, and how does center and state sort of mix? So what typically ails there? Can you just explain where does it get lost?
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity. And So the key point which we need to understand as we look at housing is that most of the implementation responsibility and jurisdiction lies with the respective state governments. The national government at the best can give frameworks and to some extent give financial support, beyond which it boils down to the respective state governments and local governments to implement. So that is one key understanding that we need to have, and it needs to happen at state level, city level, and so on. So this is how you need to look at the responsibility from the government side on getting housing supplied. But then I think I'll support what Gautam said, that yes, we need to get these housing built, and that's one responsibility that we have. But then it's not just about getting the housing built, all these houses. There should definitely be other mechanisms to get the housing going, which means we need to recognize other forms of housing supply, which is happening. And as we speak, I would say the informal housing, rental housing market is the largest supplier of housing, even otherwise, without much policy support. So I think we should recognize that and look at how to improve situation on that front.
Typically what is, so is it a case like what Professor Bide was saying, that, land acquisition is this one of the oldest problems. With every problem we say that land acquisition was a problem, but let's keep land out. So what exactly is holding back, say, the state government? Is it a lack of money? Is it lack of, as she mentioned, a lack of understanding? What typically holds back from providing solutions? Is it political? Migrant workers may not be typically a political animal in the sense that why should some politician in Maharashtra care for, or in Karnataka care for migrants coming from UP and Bihar? What do they gain? And similarly, in UP and Bihar, why do they care if these guys are mostly spending time in Karnataka and Kerala? So where is the problem? What's holding back?
See, okay, so the simple answer to this is the greater level of difficulty in getting this solved. Like, at least in ownership housing, you have the household which actually takes the effort to get the housing done, and there is a motivation for them, and they take an effort to pay, which is where you find quite a lot of initiatives happening on the ownership front. But here in rental housing, you will have to understand that the user, which is the migrant in this case, who is going to pay the rent, is not going to participate in the process of getting the housing supplied directly, or is not going to financially contribute to the process of getting the supply done. So it involves a clearly another actor who is part of the supply side, who is going to do it. That just adds another layer of complexity. Now, is it not happening as we are speaking? It is happening. It has always happened. How informal, right? Like, people have supplied, you're paying guests, hostels. You find migrants, 4 migrants sharing 2 beds and doing 2 shifts. And using the same infrastructure. It's also in many times out of choice and a combination of compulsion that this happened. It just got accentuated when COVID happened. Like, nothing much drastically changed on that one fine day in March 2020. Like, the situation is exactly the same prior to that. And when we hear Mr. Chair saying, like, a developer had to fly in his laborers to continue work, then the question which probably I would ask is like, okay, so maybe you did not provide suitable housing to your workers in the first place, that you had to airlift them to get them to start working, right? Like, so you can actually look at it from different perspectives. But then the state issue is that the focus and the priority seem to be on ownership housing. Like, even in the PMAY scheme, while the entire practitioner world has been talking about absence of rental housing, we needed a COVID, and we needed all this awareness on the subject of challenges in migrant housing, which had to kind of push to start an affordable rental housing complex scheme. And otherwise the housing for all scheme did not have a rental component as such. So the issue is pre-COVID. It's been there. It got accentuated because of the COVID situation. The solutions have whatever were happening needs to be developed. We need to look at drastically different solutions now going forward, because it's very apparent that whatever earlier was happening is not yielding the desired results. And especially when it talks about migrant housing, bulk of the solution is actually not in housing domain. So I'll register that point here as well. Like quite a lot of things have evolved. Migration happens for a reason. Livelihood, the way employment contracts have structured, like most of us are in formal employment, but just look around. Even in our offices, the housekeeping or the food court and pretty much bulk of the services are provided by outsourced employees, which means there are issues in which the employment side has also evolved, which kind of makes the pressure higher on non-ownership housing, and that is what is leading to affordability challenges, uncertainties, and to that extent, we are contributing to this through activities which are beyond core housing domain. And I'll make one small point here, which is again not related to housing. We are currently talking about a climate or a narrative where the government, or for that matter, even the affluent people, are thinking or saying about giving some benefit to someone without realizing that, or kind of making it somebody's problem and not our problem as such. But then what we should realize is we are also part of the problem, and we have created this problem, and it's our responsibility to get a solution done, and it needs to be looked at from that perspective.
Right. I'll start circling back for solutions, but before that, let me come back to Shayana about that specific question about some global examples on how other countries have sort of looked at this thing. And one particular thing, and whether you want to take that in your answer or later on when Professor Bide, we start with Professor Bide on where the solutions lie, is that in India, it typically think about migration in terms of people going from villages to cities, but data suggests that, a high amount or an equal amount or perhaps a biggest amount of migration happens from villages to villages, from rural area to another rural area in another state. So is the housing problem only an urban problem, or are there, is there a rural component to it also? I mean, urban is right in our face, but rural we do not know, and we seem to believe that it doesn't really matter. But that I'll just flag here, and maybe whoever wants to take that rural question also. But Shayana, what exactly can we learn from any of the other countries, China, Mexico, wherever?
Yeah, Udit, what I would do is maybe just synthesize, because actually there are quite a few country examples. There's a global World Bank report, which I am happy to share the link, and I would encourage viewers to go and look at those. But let me synthesize 3 principles, which I think are actually critical as we start to think about these solutions. And I think, Udit, this relates to the question you asked just earlier, what's holding the states back? I would again argue it's actually the lack of decentralization when it comes to allowing for more creativity and context-specific solutions. Because even with an ARHC and, as part of the World Bank's support to the national government during the time of COVID, we were supporting various reforms to try and improve access to social protection, particularly for migrants. And if you look at these systems very closely, they continue to be exactly the same scheme, and in silos. The state is doing something, the center is doing something, with very little clarity on how all of these will combine. And in fact, even where the state is supposed to implement, the hands of the state are fairly tied when it comes to the very rigid rules. So for example, who is a beneficiary of a certain scheme? When we look at the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, and the urban version of it as well, it's very specific rules, very specific databases, which have their own problems managed at the national level. And how you target doesn't really allow the state currently, and certainly not the municipality, enough space and decentralization. In fact, the first principle from all other global experiences is decentralize, decentralize, decentralize. These are extremely empowered municipal agents involved not only in thinking about housing, but thinking of housing as part of social protection, as a bundle of core entitlements and rights that workers have and they carry with them, and allowing municipalities to respond. So take the example of China. When COVID hit and there were certain provinces and certain regions within China where the crisis was much more acute, at that point of time, it was very much local governments. It was the local municipal, their version of what we would call the municipal government, which was involved in providing cash transfers, social housing as well, to migrants. So I think the point is, and these solutions look very different actually across regions in China as well, depending on the nature of the crisis, because you may not want the same benefits across the board. Maybe it's a specific area that needs that support at that point of time. So the first principle is extremely empowered municipal governments, not this one size fits all, same scheme, PMAY, which runs exactly the same way everywhere else with the same benefit levels. That's one. The second is, and I think this is something that all of us have been talking about, the focus in India tends to be very supply side driven. It's very much around, I think, land, housing, construction. And obviously there are very serious and grave regulatory challenges around this. But if you look at Latin America in particular, Udit, they've used a lot of demand side incentives. So what they're doing is there is essentially the system which provides a certain core income security grant. It could be cash, it could be certain kinds of vouchers, it could be systems that allow people to seek for certain kinds of support along with employment support. And these are portable, adaptive systems whereby if you're moving from Bihar to Delhi, you're at least carrying a certain core cash benefit, not just the PDS benefit. Right now, remember, it's only PDS that's portable. We're not talking about portable income support. Right now, that's not really being discussed. Whereas if you look at the Latin American example, the argument is people will figure out creative ways through the market, through informal markets, to find housing or other kinds of support. What the government perhaps needs to do is, along with the employer, provide a core basket of cash as well as insurance benefits. And I think so the second is essentially beyond decentralization, thinking about not just the demand, looking at the demand side, not just the supply side. And there, I think cash support and all of these issues become very critical. And linked to that, Udit, is the fact that our current system, unlike other countries which have been able to provide much more effective support, and I'm particularly again looking at China, Philippines, even Indonesia, what they've been able to do is they have core dynamic systems of delivery. And what that means is that right now, if I'm a migrant in a certain area, and even if we believe they're providing cash or a housing voucher, or maybe you have a social housing complex and you want to give someone access to, say, a certain amount of period of time for them to stay there, how will they approach this particular program? Who is the point of interface? In rural areas, we have panchayats, we have Narega, PMAY runs through those panchayats as well. The municipal and city version of that just doesn't exist currently. So we have a national urban digital mission right now that's been announced, again under Mahua, which is supposed to develop digital capacities to create these delivery mechanisms for cash, insurance, other kinds of in-kind benefits as well. But those systems are currently woefully weak when it comes to urban areas. So if you look at these other countries, what they've done is they've decentralized, particularly empowering local governments, credibly so, not just saying on paper states will decide, but actually allowing them to decide benefit levels. And there's a regulatory framework between center, state, and municipality to do that. And I'm particularly thinking of the Chinese example here. And if you look at the Latin American example, looking very specifically at demand side incentives for workers. So you believe that workers themselves can, as Gautam was saying, they will find, based on their incentives, proximity to work, the right housing environment. What government perhaps can do is during times of crises and shocks, they can provide a certain core amount of income support. And that right now, I don't hear that conversation as much in India. You heard that a little bit right after the COVID crisis, but I don't hear it as much again. And the third would be, as I mentioned, just the capacity of the delivery system. Not just, and Udit, this answers your question about rural and urban, because the point is if you're moving, then you should have a system of social protection that moves with you. And then that can, based on some kind of policy environment, you define what that core basket of I don't like the word benefits. I think what are those entitlements? What is it that you carry with you, which is a dignified, and I think if you use the ILO or the World Bank or the ADB, there's a core set of definitions, and housing increasingly is part of that. So I would say several examples from Latin America, Philippines, Indonesia, Brazil, in particular, China as well, specifically looking at decentralization, improved delivery systems which are portable, dynamic, can move with you, and look much more at the demand side. And when I say demand side, not just cash, but also insurance, because one thing that we're not talking about right now, which is a big challenge globally, is that the housing crisis isn't just about people finding a place to stay, but it's actually that place being productive and safe for them. So if you look at now natural disasters, given India is so precarious, we saw floods in different cities, right from Chennai, various other places. People's homes and habitats are constantly at risk. And so thinking about insurance programs and support during times of disasters from the demand perspective, from the perspective of workers, I think is absolutely key, as opposed to the current conversation, which tends to be have a scheme, which is the same everywhere, have essentially just, these siloed approaches of municipalities doing something, state is doing something, center has a different program. And also no discussion right now about cash income support, because those you would think if there's a living wage, rental transfers could be part of that potentially as well. So I'll stop there. I think these are three key principles which need to be very clearly thought through. And right now, in fact, India, other than perhaps the delivery systems conversation that's happening now because of this digital mission and various other state level initiatives, we're not seeing very much traction on these. So I'll stop there, Udit.
Right. Thanks a lot. Decentralize. Don't be just focused on supply. Think of demand side support and the capacity of the delivery system. Three main points that you made. I know Gautam has a hard deadline. He'll have to leave us. So if Professor Bide allows, can I first go to Gautam? Gautam, at the heart of it, where do the solutions lie? Where do you think, 2, 3, 4 points that you think we need to look at for finding any semblance of solution? Because it seems like the crisis, the problem scale is too big. We can't find a solution too quickly, but what do you think we should do?
I think we have to think of ways of moving, right? So I don't think we're going to find solutions in a way that close off these things, because one of the core things that what Shayana just said, right? In a way, housing is a question of wage and a question of time, right? And if you have a question of wage stagnation, demand support to families will effectively get us through crisis. But in the medium term, you cannot answer a housing question in a structurally unequal economy where wages are stagnant. There is no market solution, no supply solution that will do enough. But we've got to make some moves now. So here are my suggestions on the way we should think about this. First, I want to endorse the last part of what Shayana said. We have got to remember that when we were growing up, it was always roti, kapda, and makan, right? And the thing is around the question of social protection, the makan has fallen off. Pension, it's PDS, it's basic income, it's insurance, it's health insurance, but never housing. Housing has been turned into the commodity in a financialized housing market. And I'm struck by how much Mr. Chahal, and I was very impressed by many of the things he was saying. When he spoke about food and ration and food packets, he spoke about a safety net. When he spoke about housing, we went to FSI, land and developers. And I think there is a really telling moment in that move. And I understand the complexity in which he's stuck. We have to help him create a different language of housing where housing returns to some part of its basic entitlement framework. Because if we keep thinking of it as a commodity to be delivered through the market, those inequalities will persist. So what does one do with that? It means the way you measure your urban poverty line should have rent. It means the way you do BPL and EWS should have rent. It means that if we think about minimum cash transfers, we should think about rent. And one very important thing about the rental market in urban India is that for the bottom 25% of households, landlords are equally poor as their tenants. I have to emphasize this. There are many ways in which the question of rent is not just about large landlords who make a lot of money. Working class households use rent as a core part of basic income. So you have a separate strategy for the bottom quarter, where when you intervene in low-income rental housing markets, it is both the renter and the landlord that you're looking to help. That opens up many kinds of ways like rent-based cash transfers and vouchers, etc. The second thing I want to emphasize here is the other thing about the employer who's airlifting. I want to echo Mani's point. If you think about Bombay and think about worker housing that was equitable, your first thought is the chawl. What is the chawl? The chawl is also a relation that the responsibility of the housing of the worker in some part falls on the employer. So when Mr. Chahal says that we all are in this together, I agree. But that we all is not just developers on the private side, it's employers on the private side. And Amita's point where we started, that different kinds of employers have different relationships to migrant workforces. Rebuilding the link between employment, work, and housing is critical. I'll give you a simple example. In two Supreme Court judgments 20 years apart, the Supreme Court has argued that construction companies are responsible for the housing of construction workers. They should not be living on site as they do today. We have never been able to implement this basic responsibility. We created RERA, where every construction project has to be registered. On that registration portal, you are never asked where your workers will live. On that registration portal, you are never asked the way in which those benefits are protected. So we've got to start some part of our policy response to this. Cannot just be incentives. Some part has to be mandates that reestablish and say, look, you are bringing in workers to the city, you want to build large-scale housing, not just 25% inclusionary zoning, reconnect employment and the right to housing for workers that come from a worker status, right? This is not entitlements and benefits of social protection alone. These are labor rights and entitlements of workers. The third thing I want to counter is this idea that there's not enough land. I'm from Delhi. When the Commonwealth Games came, we found land for 5 stadia. When the metro had to be built, we found the land. When we had to build the BKC in Bombay, they found the land. Okay? There is always land. The question is, do you want to use the land you have for low-income housing or not? And this is the question we have to ask. Not why land should go into the special development zone or the no development zone. Why is BKC the only claim to land in Bombay and not low-income rental housing? And I think it's, all of Delhi's slums, all of them sit on 0.5% of the city's land. We are not even regularizing those. So we are not willing for 15% of the city to let go of half a percentage of land. This is not a question of land not being available. This is not only a question of acquisition. We have to take a political call, if at the very least, in cities where a majority of low-income settlements, which hold a majority of low-income rental, are on public land, then we need to ask ourselves as a public, what holds back beginning today, post-COVID, regularizing all of those settlements and the rental housing that's within them so they can grow and improve and continue to rent out to further housing. The question of land is not a question of vacancy, availability, or cost. It is a question of political commitment. And we have to be very clear about this, and we've got to take this on. And my last point then is that when we think a little bit about building rental markets by recognizing and upgrading existing housing settlements, by looking and regulating and improving existing housing, even as we build new rental housing through all of these market mechanisms that I endorse. The last part I want to argue is, if this is as much a political fight as it is a technical one for policy, who's going to fight this fight? The one thing that COVID has shown us is that it was large-scale organizations of workers who stepped up and connected the question of that relief. Domestic worker unions got cash transfers happening. Worker organizations moved and mobilized migrant workers. To me, one of the key questions that will determine expected housing for migrants, and I would love for the state to do this, to endorse, recognize, and further support collectivization and collective forms of worker organization. Because if we really are all in this together, then we need actors that represent workers to be part of discussions like this, part of discussions on the policy framework, and those worker organizations need to be supported and recognized. And they will be built anyways, they are being built anyways, but if they become policy designers along with the state, if they get recognition with the state, in one way, Shayana, I feel like this is a way to do decentralization. It is a way to think of partnerships. It is a way to work with organizational workers and say, tell us where workers are, help us get to them. The partnership shouldn't only be with the corporate houses. The partnership should also be with the worker federations. And I think that's a very critical part that we don't quite see as technical answers, but this is a political question. So all our answers cannot be technical.
That's a very spirited response, but it has left me, just a little more depressed about the whole situation because, between you and Shayana, the demands you're asking of the system are too many. Decentralization, this is not the time to talk.
That's why, Udit, I gave you recognize and upgrade all slums. Easy, simple, one government order, no land required, no paisa to be spent. There's my quick action point.
I'll run back to the teacher, which is Professor Bhide in this regard. Give us the answers, because honestly, decentralization, it's a travesty. The local self-government and the Panchayati Raj and all of that is, any data that you look up, it's just a farce, nothing short of that. So, and we are struggling. Look at what has happened to Delhi. We haven't figured out whether it's a state or not and how it will be run. So, if Delhi we cannot figure out, which is the national capital, the state of affairs across the country and decentralization is these are valid points, but and similarly on demand support or what you said about Roti Kapla and Makan. That movie is old now. It seems totally different movies now on play. So now let me get back. We'll have 4 or 5 questions which are stacked up. But before that, I'll come back for the last word to Professor Bhide on where do the solutions lie. You've heard some of obviously what Shayana and Gautam have said. But where do you see the solutions lie? Which direction should we go to? That you mentioned a very potent phrase of policy amnesia. So how does it get solved? And one more thing that sort of depressed me is the thing that who will drive the change, and who will drive the change honestly? Where is the political push for this? As I said, this is something that I think Professor Irudaya Rajan said in the very first episode, that you have to give them political rights. Can they vote in Maharashtra and bring down the government? That kind of a thing. Can they shift political narratives? So where do the solutions lie? How do we go solving this?
Tough call you have given me. But I would perhaps just say that we need to think of a continuum of solutions and a range of solutions. There cannot be one solution to this kind of a complex problem, which is enmeshed with social protection on one hand, decentralization on other, state capacity, demands and wage stagnation on the other, the lack of labor rights, the lack of unclear policy. So for all of that, when we are trying to find solutions within housing as a sector, clearly these are going to be limitations, but we need to think of a continuum. But let me begin with a positive example. I was actually surprised that Mr. Chahal didn't mention this example, because I'm going to start with a positive example perhaps happening in Mumbai, perhaps because I'm hopeful. Okay? As part of the development plan and the DCPR 2034 of Mumbai, one of the things which has been done is that it has got a gender policy. And within the gender policy, there is a range of amenities, especially for women, which have been conceptualized. One of these is of multi-purpose housing for women. And where every ward in Mumbai, there have been lands reserved under the DP where these multi-purpose housing will be created. There are already 2 such buildings underway. Okay? And to me, this is the approach. If we look at, we have also as a advisory committee to the municipal corporation created a policy for how to operationalize this housing. Okay, what should be the rates, and the way in which we have tried to operationalize this is to keep it open, that this will not be linked to any kind of domiciles. Okay, this will be a facility where people can stay for indefinite periods, that these are not going to be working women's hostels per se, where there is a social welfare and a schematic thing which is hanging above. Okay. Now, this is at present a policy which has not undergone the test of politics. Okay. These are buildings yet to be built. Okay. But I feel fairly hopeful that when the municipal corporation takes the lead in order to create such amenities, And if there are also partnerships built with fairly capable agencies who can stay true to the spirit, we will be able to create at least a few amenities for women, which happens to be currently also women migrants, single women, happens to be a very, very vulnerable contingent, often not recognized at all. So this is about a hopefully positive example. Okay. And I do believe that these kind of formal housing solutions definitely are one part of the solution. They can at least work in cases where there are large employers and there are contracted employees who are invisible, but where there is a tripartite partnership which can be created between the state, agencies which can deliver, and the employers. The employer's role in this is immense. On the other end of the continuum, completely other end, I think we need to also focus on how does one reduce the precarity of housing, because there are several housing conditions which shouldn't be accepted at all. About 2 years ago, again going by Mumbai's example, workers staying in a farsan factory, a food making factory. Okay, they were sleeping on the loft of that factory in which they lived as well. Okay, and the loft gave way. About 5 of these workers died in a fire because the entire floor on which they were sleeping collapsed. Many of them were burnt by the hot oil which was there below. Now, when we are talking about these kind of hazards, or people who are exposed to extremely, I would say, inhumane conditions of living and working, both, because both of these are collapsed together, that I think is where we also need some kind of a knowledge. Overall, I agree with the principle completely. I endorse what Gautam suggested, is to look at informal housing and begin where they are. There is no issue of acquisition. The more you are able to upgrade the living conditions in the informal settlements, the conditions of rental housing would also improve. There would be a certain amount of gentrification, but I hope that this will also contribute to creating a lever where one is creating like a basic floor below which a quality of housing will not go. But if there are these kind of very precarious housing conditions, one needs, I think, what is called a velvet glove approach, where one is both, the state comes in with regulatory policies, but the state also comes in with facilitative policies, right? Like we talked about the CNG facilitation, CNG shift, right? You can at once abolish it, but you need to also give loans by which you can shift and transit to something which is more greener, I would say. And the same approach we need to take with respect to the existing solutions. In between these, I would locate really that it is really not just the market, not just, but society is implicated. The employers are implicated. The share of employers consistently, and we fare very poorly on even the registration of workers. So the one element which I thought I would add to what Shayana has said, Gautam has said, is not just data, it's talking about the knowledge. Okay? And often many of our institutions lack the knowledge. When we create digital data about who the workers are, the institutions and people of the institutions, the delivery systems that Shayana was talking about, they lack the knowledge, or if they have the knowledge, they do not pass it on to policies. So one really needs to create, I think, a micro knowledge at this current juncture is completely lacking in our systems. They have macro data, but they don't have the micro knowledge of how things operate, of what things exist, what are the issues linked to people. I mean, even in those food packets, if Mr. Chahal can even tell us, who are those 3.5 lakh people to whom the food was delivered? On what basis were needs assessed? And one will find that other than people giving a telephone call, and that is the only element of demand, the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai currently completely lacks any kind of knowledge of who are the migrants, what are the migrants doing, Okay? So how do we begin to even garner knowledge about that? So these would be my 3 beginning points, and I'll stop.
Masterful, Professor Bide. It's just such a massive problem to sort of even start thinking about how to solve it. And as you said, it has to be a continuum. There is no one simple button which we can press and solve it. Let's quickly go to some questions. We have 4 or 5 people lined up. Let's quickly take their questions. I think first is, I think, Saili Mankikar. Can we patch her through?
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, hi. My question would be to all panelists, but to Dr. Bhide actually, that, she brought out very relevant points. I thought that, the one thing that, we found in our studies, and I'm a researcher as well, is that the data related to migration is, we have one 2011 census and no micro data. So should there be like a city level separate census that does happen? And also, is there a scope to form city level policies, a city level migration policy or migrants policy, which has all these factors in it, which is basically looking at micro data, which looks at housing and social welfare as well? Is there some thinking on this, or I wanted some reaction to that?
Should I go in and respond right away?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Okay. So, in principle itself, Saili, thanks for that question, which is a very provocative one. But I think cities should not have migration policies. Because if cities have migration policies, they would essentially be anti-migration policies. Okay? Migration in our country exists because at a national level, there is a freedom of movement. If you look at otherwise city politics, it is largely anti-migrant. It is very pro-local. In fact, there would be several eruptions there. So, which is why I talked about this velvet glove approach. There has to be some kind of non-negotiables which the center puts in, but the operationalization of these principles. See, our 74th constitutional amendment, for example, talks about the improvement of weaker sections and the protection of vulnerables, socio-economic development as part of the list of essential functions for cities. But there is no cadre within any of the municipalities to even adhere to this function, okay, to even conceptualize that. And to that extent, I think the point that Shayana was talking about in terms of decentralization matters. So at the city level, policies should differ. What kind of packages, what kind of needs, what form of housing, where, how, the arrangements that can be made specific, that can differ according to the economy of the cities, the land arrangements, the institutional capacity, several other things, factors which are highly differentiated, but that they should be compelled to perform this function. That has to be a mandate which comes from a higher level of government.
Right. Yeah, Shayana, you wanted to say something?
Just a couple of things, Udit. I fully agree with what Professor Bhide just said. There has to be, we still don't have, and there's a draft that Niti Aayog produced on sort of what will be the norms of cooperation across states when it comes to migrants. And we still don't have a very clear sense of what is the what is the accountability framework for migration at the government level. That just doesn't exist. And obviously that will frame how all of these questions, and I think what will the city policy be, has to then be in compliance with certain frameworks that exist. Now, take the Chinese example. And it's interesting that we're using a Chinese example, given that they manage migration flows so strongly. But one of the things that the country does do is that there's a very clear sense of what is the role of center state and even local government. And there's a broad set of adhering principles, and we don't have that right now. And just one thing that I would like to just put on the table why this is important is, for example, even if you take the PDS example right now, if there are migrants moving from Bihar to Delhi, the question of compensation of who pays for what and where is the central share for benefits for migrants has not really been fully addressed or answered. So, cities can be dynamic only if it's clear what the framework is. So that's one. And other, I think, just to respond to the question, and Udit, also your depression about solutions, I actually do think that the delivery system is low-hanging fruit. With all its challenges between Aadhaar, the socioeconomic census, different states are doing different things. There's also the PDS database itself, which is one of the most valuable assets the country has as a knowledge database, because people are using it. 800 million people, as you said, Udit, who are using it. Why can we not start to think about using that as the first layer as opposed to a city census? I think the lady just mentioned. I think as a principle, again, going and collecting additional data when you already have data, why not make use of what you already have, build on these systems? And I think then that can allow for if you have a system that works, then other kinds of solutions can be layered onto it. And we have the building blocks in place. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Right. Thanks a lot. I think the next question is by Arkaja Singh from the Center for Policy Research.
Hi, this is Arkaja. I don't actually have a question, so I don't know how my name has come up. I'm sorry,
Okay.
but
No worries.
I've been listening in, and it's an excellent discussion, and I'm so glad I tuned in. But I don't have a question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for listening in. At least, thank you. Let's move on to the next question. I think this is Ms. Abha Mishra from UNDP.
Yeah, one thing which struck to me when the PMC commissioner was saying is about this quite involved in that. But I would like to understand a little more how you such the public there was some mention that rental housing could happen by organically by the local community and others. But is there the mechanism to make it more organized? I'll just give you just a brief example, which I had. My sister from US had mentioned that she had bought a condo area for very these vulnerable socio-economic weaker sections in their community, and she ran it for 3 years, where the government also puts in some money while the owners are responsible for taking care of certain amenities of the community. So I would like to know, can that mechanism work in India? And if it can work, what type of policy advocacy is required? Thank you so much for giving me the chance.
Thank you. Mr. Manikandan, would you like to take that? It's low-cost housing, innovative solution.
Yeah, sure. I think that's one of the components of the larger solution. Like we did hear quite a lot of solutions which are coming up, which was discussed in the session. One of the things which we can do is we still need to supply housing. Like in absolute numbers, like we need to increase the numbers. And most of the suggestions and discussions we were looking at is predominantly on the informal side of things. But if we still need to develop formal housing solutions in the rental space, we need to look at mechanisms like these, including, or I would put it generically, like we need to find zero cost lands. Now, it's not absolute zero cost, but then what would effectively be zero cost lands? And we need to get that going. Like, so for example, industrial associations, like larger industrial areas would, it would have already earmarked residential zones. And if we can get housing happening which is at the moment not happening in a concerted manner, it would not probably go to that individual whom we saw in the television channels standing outside Anand Vihar ISBT terminus, but then it would actually release some pressure on most of these cities in absolute terms by releasing some amount of renters who are otherwise now taking up the rental solutions available within the cities, right? Like if we can release some amount of pressure, then there is an opportunity to decongest and declog this whole issue of actually having to find housing. I think this perspective, like if we can visualize that we are not getting that one house built for that one person who was that migrant laborer. But then if we are looking at a larger city level plan and see that if we can increase the overall supply of rental housing in the market and ensure it is getting occupied, which is another key factor, like if we are able to get that done, mechanisms like these, like condos for informal workers, or even we discussed heavily about reservation in terms of land use planning, or even in terms of housing supply, a combination of all these formal mechanisms, even if it does not benefit the direct migrant whom we are talking about as subject of this session. But overall, at a city level, if we can remove that kind of numbers out of the larger scheme, we would find some kind of solutions happening in the informal segment, making housing situation better for the migrants.
Thanks a lot. Let's move on to, I possibly think is the last one. We have the last time for one last question. Sandhya Iyer from, I think, Tata Institute of Social Sciences.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry, my camera is not functioning for some vague reason, but I've been really enjoying the discussion that's happening. I just wanted to first flag a comment before I come to my specific questions. And I have a question for each of the speakers. We were just doing an evaluation of the infrastructure displacement in Mumbai city since 2004 to 2018 itself as part of the large-scale work that's going on. We have estimated a rough estimate of about 65,000 odd households already displaced within the city for infrastructure expansion. And this includes the metro projects, it includes the coastal road projects, etc., etc. So having said that, I think the basic problem I feel is that though we are all talking about housing, we fail to understand that the Land Acquisition Act, which was written in 2013 and brought into purpose, we have had a strong rural focus, failing to understand that there's an urban application failure. Where do we really align ourselves? So I think we are refusing to see that legislations are across spaces, but they are not defined effectively well. And that seems to be the malady when you start listening to, absolute senior technocrats like Chahal, who have tried to give us a very the blueprint which fails to look at people in it. The reason why I'm coming to this point is as follows. If I were to look at, and this is a specific question to Professor Bhide, she very importantly raised that we need to categorize migrants. And we assume that migrants are all living only in informal settlements. If you go to the gems and jewelry industry, the bakery industry, workers live in the enterprises. Where do we make that presence? How do we account for them? There are workers in micro enterprises surviving in the enterprises. So do we really look at it in a more serious manner? The second question, which comes to Gautam Bhan, if I can ask.
Ma'am, may I? First of all, Gautam has left and we are really short of time. So if we can just limit ourselves to the question you've asked, Professor Bhide, and we have
a social policy question also, if you may please give me the permission for that.
Okay, please ask.
Thank you. So if you look at the Social Security Code, the word housing comes only once for the state government and it's not been elaborated. So how do we factor in social housing there? How do you make governments accountable? Do they really have we are talking about political will, but there's no blueprint available therein. So I personally feel we are trying to fit the wagon before the engine and assume that yes, everything will follow in its place. Can I get at least these two answers? And of course, thanks for the opportunity. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for asking these questions. Professor Bhide, all yours.
Okay. No, I think in response to Professor Sandhya's question, Just a quick thing. I agree with you that the LAR Act completely lacks a urban understanding. In fact, several of us within the country had tried to come together to say that one should think of a urban policy as well. But this has been an opportunity that is missed. On the other hand, I also think that local politics has ensured that there have been significant amounts of resettlement and compensatory projects which have been undertaken in several cities. Now, these are not very inclusive ones. I will not even get into the discussion of whether they are comprehensive rehabilitation or primarily only compensate for a residential tenement that is also very unsustainable. So I think those are points which are completely out of the loop. But I think one of the things linked to our today's topic is really that even within these, one ensures, and most governments ensure, that you are eligible. So the first section to be cut out is the migrant workers, because they don't have the domiciles, they don't have the documents, and therefore what happens to their accommodation, and how does one make their housing more precarious because of this kind of a approach is something that one needs to look at as well. Thank you.
I'm afraid we are totally out of time. Let me just personally thank all the participants here, and now invite Ms. Shilpa Kumar, who's partner Omidyar Network India, for her concluding remarks.
Thank you, Udit. This was such a really rich discussion. I really enjoyed hearing it. For me, when I look back to COVID days, I think the exodus of migrants really meant two things. One is it showed actually that, the drivers of our economic growth and of our cities was really a large number of people who are migrants to these cities. I think the other thing it really kind of proved was how important safety and security of your home is. Because when there is trouble, when there are pandemics, when there are natural disasters, it's really the home that you seek shelter in. And I think the image of, therefore, the migrant exodus really highlighted the fact that, housing was not available in a safe and secure way. I thought the discussion really, touched upon so many different things. I thought, really important comment of why do people come to cities? If it's for work, do we really understand the needs of all of these people as consumers of housing, as consumers of city services? And do we maybe need to spend a lot more time to actually understand, this issue a little bit more? I thought the other takeaway for me really was, it's not like this need is not being met. This need is being met. It's being met largely through informal housing. And there are implications of that. The implications, really explained both by Commissioner Chahal as well as Professor Bhide, are the, sheer precariousness and maybe vulnerability, not just of day-to-day, conditions of living. It can be day-to-day, access to water, access to sanitation, all of which have an implication for health, but also the long-term, or rather the more pressing requirements that when there's a pandemic or a natural disaster, what happens? Because informal housing is naturally more vulnerable and more precarious. I thought that was really, something that highlighted for me the need for better housing, which took into account the workers' needs for mobility as well as residents. I thought there were, three other things that I really stood out for me. Who is really the agent of change in this scenario? Is it governments who are, maybe because they are actually their cities are benefiting? Should it be governments who pay a lot more attention, or should it be employers, given that the link between a large number of migrant workers and employers is somewhat tenuous? I thought that was really a big question that came up, and in a way answered maybe by Commissioner Chahal saying that There was someone who really sent, a plane to get workers back. And I think that really highlighted maybe the dependence of both industry as well as migrant workers. The last thing in terms of, okay, and therefore what's to be done, I think one thing was very clear from all panelist comments, which is that the large availability of informal housing itself is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to maybe formalize the settlement, number one. Within that, formalize access to rights for people so that they can build better homes and get better access to services. And I thought, the point came out that is probably the, first and most easily accessible opportunity for improving quality of housing. I think the other thing that came out was really the role of, rental housing in general. And I really liked what Gautam said, which is you can't build your way out of this problem, just given the sheer magnitude of what it had. I was also struck actually in the end by the fact that in spite of a problem which is so large, which is so complex, there is maybe opportunity to be hopeful because there was the Model Rental Act that has come in. Professor Bhide talked a little bit about some experiments in Maharashtra, which can actually take care of a better gender focus. And therefore, to me, what this discussion really says, that in the end, safe and secure housing, if addressed, it is large, it is complex, but if addressed, can truly build cities which are, in a sense, more fundamental drivers of growth. Thank you to Indian Express and to all the panelists for this discussion.
Thank you, Shilpa. We'd like to thank our presenting partner, Omidyar Network India, for helping us put this series together, and our webcast partner, 24 Frames Digital. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. We will be continuing this series focusing on very specific aspects of migration like women and children, education, labor laws, in a bid to get a deeper understanding of the challenges that lie ahead and hopefully to find some direction. We'll be in touch as we announce the next event.